Greetings. Welcome to ITR Live. I'm your host, Chris Hagen. We are back here today for a wonderful action-packed episode. Joined here again in studio by ITR Foundation President Chris Ingstad and ITR Policy Director John Hendrickson. They are thrilled to be here. They have figured out how to get the headphones on their head, and I can tell they are very eager to get started. So to begin with today, I guess I just wanted to start with something that I was thinking a lot about over the weekend, gentlemen. So I was driving around the state of Iowa over the weekend. I was following my son around to a couple of soccer matches, and it was just a beautiful fall weekend in Iowa. And we talked a little bit on past podcasts, and you hear it in the media a lot when we're talking about growing the state, that, well, we don't have mountains and we don't have beaches and the winters are hard. And how do we get people to want to come to Iowa? And as I drove across the state of Iowa across the weekend with the leaves changing colors and idyllic temperatures and farmers out in their fields bringing in the grains that feed the world. And it occurred to me that Iowa is, in fact, a wonderful place. And I'm not going to apologize for it. I'm not going to try and lament the fact that we don't have what maybe some other states have. Is that Iowa is a wonderful place to live. I am proud to call it my home. The communities that we have, the people we have, the opportunities that we have are plentiful. And it is my home. And so I'm going to keep that in mind as we talk in the future about growing this state. And yes, tax policy matters when we do that. But I guess it was just a reminder to me of just how wonderful this place is and how blessed we are to call it our home. So that's my opening. It probably doesn't measure up with your favorite cable talk show host, but I needed to get that off my chest today. So, John, I'm not going to ask you how much you love Iowa because I know it'll never stack up to the Great North. But Chris, I know you're a lifelong Iowan. And I hope you share some of that sentiment.
I share all of that sentiment.
Good. Well, you know what? I want my kids. I've said this from the beginning of my political career. Like, why do you do what you do? I chose to stay in Iowa when I graduated school. You chose to stay in Iowa when you graduated from school. And I want my children to be able to chase whatever dreams they have in Iowa because those opportunities are available. Because they were available to me, and that's what we're trying to preserve and grow for the next generation. If those dreams take them someplace else in the great big world, then that is fantastic too. But in the meantime, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that those opportunities are available right here in the great state of Iowa. So with that all having been said, let's talk about what is great in Iowa. And yesterday, Chris, ITR Foundation had a memo on the end of the state fiscal year and showing just how strong our state is being managed, which is a big part of that ongoing opportunity and strength as a state.
So you get to riff unimpeded on how wonderful the state is and all the Iowa values and opportunity, and then you throw it to me to talk about tax dollars.
I threw it open to you to talk about how great Iowa was, and you said yes.
Well, you took you took everything. There was nothing left for me to say.
Well, that's fine.
It is.
I mean, look, you're
first of all, you took the nicer mic to say it, and then you said all this stuff, and then you throw it to me to talk about tax dollars. So
it sounds wonderful too. I'm sure it's going to be great, but we all stay here, whether it was by choice or just circumstance or whatever. But we're all in this together, right?
That's right. Iowa's a wonderful place to be. It's easy to get distracted by shiny things or something you might do on vacation somewhere across the country, and that's fine. But if you really stop and think about it, or if you have an opportunity to sort of take stock of this state, what a wonderful place to live, to raise a family, to just do life on a day-to-day basis. So many wonderful things. And I think, again, John's home is the Iron Range of Minnesota, and you can't replace home. Right, you can't undo those roots. But I like to think John would acknowledge that if he can't be in the Iron Range, where his family has been for generations, then maybe Iowa, for him at least, is maybe the second best place. Is that a fair assumption, John?
It is totally fair. I agree with that. And my first memory of Iowa was that as a graduate student, I came to West Branch for a full week to research at the Hoover Presidential Library and Museum, and I had to admit, traveling through Iowa, it's a beautiful state, and I think a shining part of our state is the Hoover campus. And so I encourage all listeners to visit West Branch and to visit the Hoover Presidential Library Museum. It's a great
John,
place.
we know you think that, and frankly, at this point, all the listeners know you think that too.
but I think there's another point there too, John, is that there are these real jewels around the state of Iowa, and they might not, smack you in the face like, a majestic mountain range or the ocean, but they are out there if you are willing to go and find them.
That's right.
And that is one of those. And there's plenty of them. And so I'm not being paid by the tourism, department of the state, but there is a lot to see and do and learn, and these great things that frankly have drawn talent to the state of Iowa, like John. Mm-hmm. And I'm done apologizing for that.
The Midwest is the best part of the country to live in by far.
Quality of life.
It is.
Quality of life.
Yep. So
and now I want to, all that out of the way, I want to talk tax dollars.
Good.
Now. Yes.
Well, it's really what we come together to do. So
that's right. That's right.
So the state's fiscal year ended on June 30th, and it takes a while to true everything up.
Correct.
And now at the end of September, we now get our look at the total of the fiscal year. So tell us what we now know.
Yep. So LSA at the end of the day yesterday released sort of what I'm going to say the final accounting for the state. Now, actually, Governor Reynolds highlighted some of that data towards the end of last week, announcing the full $1.9 billion surplus we had for that fiscal year that ended in June. But the details of that really came out yesterday. And the thing that was interesting to me is in March, so just 6 months ago, our revenue estimating conference, people who are tasked with predicting the budget, people who have experience with it, people who have done this before, predicted that this fiscal that just closed would have growth of 4.3% over the previous fiscal year. Again, that was the prediction they made in March. Now, just 6 months later, with it finally closed, everything accounted for, that growth was way more than 4.3%. The state's revenues grew by 11.5% last year. Okay, that is year-over-year growth. That is almost $1 billion more than the year before, and that, of course, contributes to that $1.9 billion surplus we had. And so things continue to be moving in the right direction in Iowa, and frankly, moving in the right direction in a big way. And maybe we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but it gives me hope that we could even have some additional income tax talks coming up at some point in the future, and maybe it wouldn't have to be the too distant future.
Right.
Could I make a point
Please,
on that?
Our listeners have been waiting now for 8 and a half minutes for that.
This is a criticism of the media, because I did see a few newspaper articles about the Iowa's budget surplus, and I think this is a huge story. And I was surprised how little attention it's getting. And I think that this is just further evidence of that Iowa is doing things right. I mean, when you look at the whole snapshot of the United States from federal policy to what different states are doing, I mean, we are fortunate to be in a state that is being governed by fiscal sanity and not insanity that's going on in Washington or in some other states. And I think I don't know, I'm just very appreciative of Governor Reynolds and the legislature for really making the hard choices of keeping spending in line and doing the pro-growth tax cuts that are helping.
And it's not just tax policy that makes some of this happen, right? I think as a legislator, you're elected, some folks think, to do something. But frankly, sometimes the best course is not to do anything, right? In other words, let's not impose some new regulations.
That's right.
Let's not otherwise legislate up to the gills and stifle business or commerce or those sorts of things. And so when you see folks deliver to Iowans, budgets that have restrained spending, a tax code that keeps being reduced, trying to stay away from over legislating. Is that a term, Chris? I don't know. They talk to you about legislator school, something like that, right? But then you sort of get these results. And one thing, and we talk about this at the end of this article that you can see on ITR Foundation, is not just the big time growth we had for fiscal year 2022, but along with that release, they also talked about the first quarter of this fiscal year. And for the first 3 months of this fiscal year, revenue's up over 5%. So even with the different headwinds that we've got that we're facing, inflation or otherwise, things are still moving in the right direction for Iowa. And I don't want to assume that we'll go smooth sailing forever. Right. There are some serious headwinds, most of which, by the way, have been produced and given to us by Washington, D.C. and leadership out there. But we continue to be in a good spot. And like you said, John, I think that's a reflection of the way that our leadership has governed in Iowa recently.
I agree. And one thing, too, and I just want to tell a quick story. And you reminded me of one of my heroes, Governor Theodore Christensen. And he served as a governor in Minnesota during the 1920s. And he said legislatures sin more by passing bad laws. And I think that's exactly right. And what we're seeing here in Iowa is they're enacting some really good legislation. And sometimes you do have to say no. And so, I think this information that came out from LSA and what the governor said is very good news. And Chris, as you know, as former majority leader, the tax cuts you guys enacted in 2018 really helped us through COVID, especially with expanding the sales tax base.
The modernization of the sales tax was big. As our economy shifted more from brick and mortar retail sales tax collections to online thing, and now it's much more commonplace. I think it's important to remember why we look at these numbers. We're a tax organization. We're about lowering Iowans' tax burden and freedom from government. But the budget matters because that is the foundation, as you guys both pointed out, for being able to return more of those dollars to Iowans. So if you spend less, it's not just good fiscal management, which it is, but it provides the foundation for reducing that burden on Iowans, which is absolutely, and you alluded to that, Chris, is that will make other things more increasingly possible in the future. And now we're looking at roughly a $3 billion surplus in our taxpayer relief fund. And if nothing else, it's a tremendous security for the day, which will come someday when state revenue collections aren't as strong, because they do ebb and flow. But we're in a tremendous fiscal position. And what we absolutely know is that all of the hand-wringing from the opponents of tax cuts was misplaced.
Right.
The tax package with 3.9% flat tax and the elimination of retirement income was absolutely appropriate at the time it was passed and signed into law back in March, when we were anticipating the 4.3% growth.
Right.
But now at 11, it has been proven to be the right course of action. And I'm not even assuming that we're seeing the benefit off that yet. And I concede that it's not phased in yet. But the foundation for the sustainability of those tax cuts is absolutely in place.
And again, just a reminder, we might have talked about it an episode or two ago. While the headline grabbing rate cuts maybe haven't been phased in yet, other good pro-growth tax reforms have been, right? In terms of small businesses, I think the inheritance tax has started to go away. So there have been these tax cuts that have been taking place since 2018. And so we have been reducing that burden, and yet we still see revenues continue to go. So
my hope is that the next time we're looking at significant tax cuts in Iowa, I'll take that back. The next time the next state out there is looking at enacting significant income tax cuts or whatever other tax cuts they have, being bold, is that when they take the ridiculous charge, well, it's going to be Kansas. We've all heard that before. Is that the answer will be, no, we're going to be Iowa.
That's right.
That's where we're going, is we are the answer.
Yeah, Iowa is now the gold standard for state-based tax reform.
And we will be looked at across the country as the model for how to do this, to how to go from a high-tax state to one that is toward the top of the list in terms of attractive tax policy.
Absolutely. And the key to that is prudent budgeting.
That's right.
That control spending, keep it limited.
There you go.
And that's a good lesson for local governments as we enter into property tax reform.
And I think too, and we'll continue to watch these budget numbers, and we will remain vigilant on them. But when there's a lot of dollars on the table, there's always the temptation to spend them, and there's certainly going to be a chorus of voices asking for those dollars to be spent on growing government. And there will be priority items, needs that government has to address because that's the nature of what government does. But we will be there to continue to encourage these policymakers to hold the line and not buy into that drive to consume more of those dollars to increase government in the state of Iowa. So that's where we're at. I think it's good. So go to itrfoundation.org and read that report. There's some really cool charts, and you can actually see it graphically depicted and learn more about just how strong Iowa's fiscal position is right now. So,
that's right.
Okay. To wrap up, I don't know if we're getting close, but I got to touch on this because it just kind of entertained me. But there was an article that was actually one of our staff members forwarded to me last night from The Economist. And I don't know that all of our listeners are subscribers to The Economist.
Well, you have to be to read the article.
Right.
And that starts to tell you a little something, but go ahead.
So it was an article in The Economist that was co-authored by Representative Ro Khanna, I think is how you say his name, and he is a Democrat member of Congress from Silicon Valley, and Iowa's Senate Minority Leader Zach Walz from Coralville, who is a Democrat, also a Democrat. And it was about how how Democrats can win back voters in these factory areas, the declining what they perceive as
Silicon Valley, of course, being a great example of a declining factory.
Who would know better than somebody that represents Silicon Valley? And they make the point throughout this article that they use the example of Maytag leaving Newton, and without I got to put in my dig, I doubt there's a lot of, or I wonder how many subscribers of The Economist are in Newton, or that at least were able to get past the paywall, because that is indicative of how Republican policies have failed, and Republicans are tone deaf on these economic realities in these towns. So, and the article just went on and on about how their answer to winning back voters in these, former industrial communities is more government spending. I mean, they point out the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, and all these things that if these voters in these areas would just wake up and realize how much money is being dumped on these boondoggle projects, that they would suddenly vote Democrat. It escapes me, but yet here we are. And I know John probably would like to riff on the trade policy section of that, because they seem to want to claim the mantle of being the ones who's going to pass trade policy that will protect him. You want to jump in on that one, John?
I do, and you guys may disagree with me, and so I want to preface that this is not the position of the foundation, but my view is that we have hurt ourselves by bad trade agreements, and former President Trump was absolutely right on this issue when he ran in 2016, and for decades we have followed a policy of trade agreements that have basically allowed manufacturers to leave, and that has hurt a lot of blue-collar, working-class Americans. I mean, we lost over 5 million manufacturers, and we set a record trade deficit of $1 trillion. And one thing that COVID exposed was how dangerously we rely on not just stuff from China, but from all over other countries for necessities. Even when you look at pharmaceuticals, for example, a large percentage of our pharmaceuticals we're dependent on China for, and that's not necessarily a good idea. So
semiconductors from Taiwan.
So we, my view is that both parties need an awakening on trade policy, and that globalization is not necessarily a good strategy to follow, because we need to put our country first.
And I wanted you to start that off, because what struck me in that is that, frankly, for most of the, let's call it post-World War II era, has been a drive towards free markets around the world, free global trade. And without passing a lot of judgment on that system, is that the only one that really ever threatened that was a Republican president, which was Donald Trump, that tried to get in and renegotiate some of those trade deals.
That's right.
It was Clinton and NAFTA, and it was on and on and on.
Yeah.
So it just, it rings hollow to hear a couple of Democrats now lamenting that no one's willing to re-examine some of these trade agreements when they were probably first in line to lampoon President Trump for trying to renegotiate some of those deals not that long ago.
As I'll just make one quick comment. As Pat Buchanan wrote, Trump was bringing back the old time religion of the long history of the Republican Party being a protectionist party.
Yeah.
As someone who grew up in a manufacturing town, right, and most of the eastern side of the state is heavy on manufacturers, along the Mississippi. Some of those folks were the forgotten or the alienated people, right? They're not interested in an agenda of any kind. This is talking about beyond trade policy, right? They're not interested in an agenda. They're not interested in anything about these buzzwords. They want to stop being blamed for things. They don't want new things shoved down their throat. They'd like to go do their job. They'd like to raise their family without government interference, without government at any level telling them what they have to do, what they can't do, how they should raise their kids, right? And I think towards the end of that article, Chris, they even talked about some of those things. And as I'm reading that, I'm thinking through my hometown, and again, a lot of factories, a lot of smokestacks where I grew up, right? And I'm thinking like, the folks there aren't interested in these things you're talking about. Right. They want to go do an honest day's work for an honest day's wage, and otherwise, raise their kids as they see fit. And that's kind of where it starts and stops, as it should. And that article seemed to miss that point. And I mean, frankly, I don't want to tell the Dems to change their messaging. I mean, keep missing the mark, but it just seems like they don't quite yet have their finger on the pulse of what what Iowa or frankly the rest of the country truly wants. I
agree with that.
So I'm gonna bring it all the way back around now. Is that because I started this episode with a fair amount of optimism and if you get around the state of Iowa, which I know is more difficult from if you spend all your time in Iowa City or Des Moines, but there's a lot of exciting things happening across the state of Iowa. And many of these communities have figured out how to remake themselves and grow and do new things, and which is the result of economic policies that make that possible. And so, while there's a long way to go in many of these communities, like you talked about, Chris, there are signs of life across the state of Iowa about new industries popping up and new ways of doing things and new ways to grow the economy. And it's exciting. So, I'm going to finish with the same optimism, or at least some of it that I started at the beginning, is that Iowa is still a great place to be. And there are plenty of reasons for Iowans to be optimistic about the future in their own communities and across the state of Iowa. So I think with that, we're over time, and I told Chris that we'd only be doing this for 20 minutes, and he's starting to get a little nervous over there because he's got some spreadsheets to get back to.
That's right.
But, and I guess the final thing as we close is be safe out there. It is harvest season, and I think those of us that live in town or primarily in town lose sight of the fact that, our farmers are out there, they're in the fields, they're on our roads, and just keep your eyes open and be safe. I know there was a significant accident not too far from the farm that my wife and I spend quite a bit of time on. And just be safe as you're out there and understand that this is a big part of what we do. So Iowa's a great place to be, folks. And we appreciate you joining us to be a part of what we think is a pretty great podcast. So leave us a 5-star review, a comment if you would like, share it with your friends. And John's giggling, and he'll be giggling again next time. And until then, we will see you next time on ITR Live.